Hi, it's Ken Hadrick, Dean of the Pie Academy, and like I promised, today we're going to tackle some of the apple pie questions you've emailed me lately. So don't go away. So let's begin with an email from Stephanie in Des Moines, who writes this. I made one of those mile-high apple pies this week, but when I cut into it, I found a big airspace under the crust. What did I do wrong? Just so you know, Stephanie, a lot of us can relate to that. We made these big, gorgeous, dome-shaped apple pies, and when we slice into it, we find that, to our horror and amazement, that there's a big cavern under the crust. Talk about a bummer. Anyway, to answer your question, Stephanie, you didn't do anything wrong. You simply got tricked into thinking that the apples were going to stay tightly packed inside the crust, but that's not happening. What is happening is that the apples are cooking down and shrinking, but the crust isn't. Okay, remember the time you lost 30 pounds and your jeans didn't fit you anymore? Well, it's like that. The apples are your waist, they're shrinking, and your old pants are your crust. That doesn't shrink, and now you've got this big gap. And what can you do about it? Well, assuming that your aim is really a very full packed apple pie, forget about the whole mile-high pie thing. Instead, try to get a few more apples into your pie at the outset by shrinking your apple slices before you bake your pie. Now, for a 9.5-inch deep dish apple pie, you normally need about 7.5 to 8 cups of apples, right? But if you pre-cook them a little, just the apples, nothing else, you can get an extra cup or so of fruit into the pie. By the way, I say pre-cooking, but you're not so much pre-cooking the apples as you are actually just relaxing them, barely heating them. You can do this on top of the stove or by putting them in the microwave to like 2 to 3 minutes. Let them cool off, then finish mixing the filling and proceed as usual. Now, Sean from Tennessee writes, Dear Ken, the filling of my apple pies is never quite right. I want a thick filling, but my apples always end up sitting in a pool of liquid. Well, I hear you, Sean. Nobody wants to play bobbing for apple slices with their piece of pie. We want a nice sort of thick glaze on our slices, right? Well, my guess, Sean, is one of two things. Either you're not using enough thickener. Remember, when apples are in season like they are now, they tend to be juicier, and we typically need to add at least 2 tablespoons of cornstarch to our pie. Or you're not baking your pies long enough for the juices to boil and for your thickener to kick in and work. Now, imagine that this is the inside of your apple pie while it's baking. The filling heats up, but your pie doesn't bake long enough for the juices to boil. The apples just sort of stew, so the thickener doesn't activate. Now, here are those apples after they've cooled, sitting in a pool of liquid like Sean talks about. Now, imagine this is your filling, and you've baked the pie long enough for the juices to bubble and the thickener to work. See how these juices look when the filling cools? I mean, it makes a nice thick glaze on the apples like many of us like. Now, I liked Betsy in California. She didn't beat around the bush. She said this, my apple pies are boring. The flavor's sort of blah, and I want to add some pizzazz. What can I do? Well, Betsy, that's a good question for the guy who wrote the book on apple pie, which happens to be me. I've got 100 recipes in here for doing just that, putting some pizzazz in your apple pies. The easiest way to do this is by going 50-50 with another fruit to create a more complex, interesting flavor. Cherries, cranberries, and pears are 3 of my favorites. Dried fruits like raisins and apricots, they're great too. But if what you're really after is pure natural apple flavor, let me tell you about one of my favorite tricks, boiled cider. Now, if you were to add plain cider right from the container to your apple pies, it would leave you with way too much liquid and not nearly enough flavor. But boil it down and you get the flavor without all the extra liquid. So start with about 2 cups in a skillet and reduce it until it just coats the bottom of the pan, maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of a cup. Now pour this concentrated cider directly on top of your apples and stir it in. Now it's sweet, so you'll only have to use about an additional 1/4 to 1/3 of a cup sugar for most apple pies. Finally, Tom writes to say that it's really his pie dough that gives him grief when he makes an apple pie. I chill the dough and I try to roll it, he says, but it just ends up cracking and making a real mess. And that, my friends, is what we're going to cover next time at the Pie Academy. So stay tuned. Meanwhile, watch for another email from me because I'm going to announce a very special offering on Le Creuset pie and tart pans. Can't wait to tell you about that. Thanks for watching today, and we'll see you next time.